Montana's lease termination framework reflects the state's independent character, while still providing a structured process that both landlords and tenants must follow. The governing law is found in the Montana Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Montana Code Annotated Title 70, Chapter 24, along with the state's summary eviction procedures in Title 70, Chapter 27. Let's start with no-cause termination. For month-to-month tenancies, Montana requires either party to provide at least 30 days written notice before the end of the rental period. The notice must be delivered at least 30 days before the next rent due date for the termination to take effect. So, if rent is due on the 1st and you want the tenancy to end on the last day of March, you need to deliver notice by March 1st at the latest. For fixed-term leases, the lease expires at the end of the agreed term without additional notice required, unless the lease specifies otherwise. If the tenant remains in possession after the term expires and the landlord accepts rent, the tenancy converts to a month-to-month arrangement under the same terms. As with most states, if you don't want this conversion to happen, communicate clearly in writing before the lease expires. For week-to-week tenancies, Montana requires 7 days' notice from either party, with the notice expiring at the end of a weekly rental period. Now let's cover termination for cause. For non-payment of rent, Montana requires the landlord to provide a 3-day notice to pay or quit. Under Section 70-24-422, the landlord must deliver written notice giving the tenant 3 days to pay the full amount of rent owed. If the tenant pays within those 3 days, the notice is void and the tenancy continues. If the tenant doesn't pay, the landlord can proceed with filing for eviction. Montana's 3-day non-payment window is among the shortest in the country. The 3 days are calendar days, and the notice must clearly state the amount owed and the deadline for payment. Proper delivery is important. The notice should be served personally, left at the tenant's usual place of residence with a person of suitable age, or sent by certified mail. For lease violations other than non-payment, Montana uses a 14-day notice to cure, followed by a 30-day termination. Under Section 70-24-422, the landlord must provide written notice specifying the violation and informing the tenant that the rental agreement will terminate in not less than 30 days if the breach is not remedied within 14 days. If the tenant corrects the violation within 14 days, the notice is void. If the tenant doesn't cure, the tenancy terminates at the 30-day mark, and the landlord can file for eviction. For repeated violations of the same type within 6 months of a prior notice, Montana allows the landlord to terminate the rental agreement with 14 days' notice without offering another opportunity to cure. This escalation mechanism is consistent with the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act model that Montana adopted and prevents tenants from repeatedly violating and curing the same provision. For serious violations, including criminal activity, drug-related offenses, and conduct that poses an immediate threat to health or safety, Montana provides an accelerated process. The landlord can issue a shorter notice, and courts can schedule hearings on an expedited basis. Montana courts take criminal activity on rental premises seriously, particularly drug manufacturing and distribution. Montana has a specific provision addressing situations involving methamphetamine contamination. If a property tests positive for meth contamination, which has been a significant issue in parts of Montana, the property may be declared unfit for habitation until decontamination is completed. This can create a complex situation where the landlord needs to terminate the tenancy, remediate the property, and potentially pursue damages against the tenant responsible for the contamination. Montana's Department of Environmental Quality has specific standards for meth decontamination that must be met before the property can be re-rented. One aspect of Montana law that's important to understand is the state's approach to mobile home parks and manufactured housing. Montana has a separate statute, the Montana Mobile Home Lot Rental Act, under Title 70, Chapter 33, that governs lease termination in mobile home parks. The rules for mobile home lot rentals differ from standard residential tenancies, and landlords who operate mobile home parks need to follow the specific procedures in that statute rather than the general Residential Landlord-Tenant Act. The eviction process in Montana goes through justice court for properties under specific value thresholds and district court for larger cases. The landlord files a complaint for unlawful detainer, and the court issues a summons to the tenant. The hearing is typically scheduled within a reasonable time after filing, though the exact timeline can vary by jurisdiction. Montana is a large state with significant rural areas, and court scheduling can be affected by the geographic realities of the judicial districts. If the court rules in the landlord's favor, a judgment for possession is entered, and a writ of restitution is issued. The sheriff carries out the physical eviction. The overall timeline from filing to removal varies depending on the jurisdiction. In more populated areas like Billings, Missoula, and Great Falls, the process typically takes 3 to 5 weeks for uncontested cases. In rural areas, the timeline may be slightly longer due to court scheduling and sheriff availability. Montana allows the landlord to seek damages in the same eviction action. This includes unpaid rent, property damage, and reasonable attorney's fees in some circumstances. Combining the possession claim with the damages claim in a single proceeding is efficient and cost-effective. On the tenant side, Montana provides several grounds for early termination. If the landlord fails to maintain the property in habitable condition, as we discussed in our Montana habitability video, the tenant can provide written notice and allow the landlord 14 days to begin making repairs. If the landlord doesn't act, the tenant can pursue remedies including lease termination. Montana's climate creates practical situations that can trigger early termination. A heating failure during a Montana winter, where temperatures in cities like Great Falls and Billings can drop well below zero, may constitute a failure to provide essential services that justifies immediate tenant action, including procuring substitute housing at the landlord's expense. Active duty military members are protected by the Service Members Civil Relief Act and can terminate with 30 days' notice following deployment or permanent change of station orders. Montana has a military presence, including Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls, so this provision is relevant to tenants in certain parts of the state. Montana provides early termination rights for victims of domestic violence under specific provisions of the Landlord-Tenant Act and related statutes. A tenant who is a victim of partner or family member assault can terminate the lease by providing written notice along with qualifying documentation, such as a valid order of protection, a police report, or a statement from a qualified professional. The tenant must provide reasonable advance notice, typically at least 30 days, and the landlord cannot charge early termination penalties or report the early termination negatively. Montana also addresses situations where a sole tenant dies during the lease term. The estate or personal representative can terminate the rental agreement by providing written notice. The estate's liability is limited to rent through the termination date and any damages to the property. The landlord must return the security deposit to the estate after accounting for any legitimate deductions. Montana strictly prohibits self-help evictions. Under Section 70-24-411, landlords cannot change locks, shut off utilities, remove doors or windows, remove the tenant's belongings, or take any action to force a tenant out. The penalties include liability for actual damages and up to 3 months' rent, plus attorney's fees. Montana courts take this prohibition seriously, and engaging in self-help can destroy a landlord's credibility in any subsequent legal proceedings. One practical consideration unique to Montana, the state's vast geography and dispersed population, creates situations that are rare in more urbanized states. Rural rental properties may be miles from the nearest town, and court proceedings may require travel to distant county seats. Tenants in remote areas may have limited access to legal services or housing alternatives. These practical realities affect how landlords and tenants navigate the termination process, and should inform how you plan and budget for potential eviction proceedings. Montana's anti-retaliation protections are found in the Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. Landlords cannot increase rent, decrease services, or file for eviction in retaliation for a tenant making a good faith complaint about habitability, contacting a government agency about code violations, or exercising any legal right under the Act. Adverse action taken within a reasonable time of the tenant's protected activity creates a presumption of retaliation that the landlord must overcome. Montana requires landlords to return the security deposit within 10 days of the tenant vacating if there are no deductions, or within 30 days if the landlord needs to assess damages and make deductions. The landlord must provide an itemized list of any deductions along with the remaining balance. If the landlord fails to comply within the required timeline, they may forfeit the right to retain any portion of the deposit. Montana's 10-day window for no deduction returns is one of the shortest in the country, so landlords need to inspect the property and process the deposit promptly. For the complete guide to Montana lease termination laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our series.